So I want to share a little bit. It's a model I've been working on as I've been doing kind of longer-term strategic work in my community. And that work often involves folks who come from really different perspectives. We try to do our best to do multi-stakeholder work, right? So people from government, people from nonprofits, people from the private sector, people from education and the academy, sometimes people from healthcare, depending on what the topic is. But our goal is to work across really different sectors, right? Because with that same idea that Chris brought earlier around complexity, right? Like no one group is going to solve it. Even if that one group has been invested and committed for 30 years on the issue, that one group cannot possibly have all of the answers for what we're facing. And so my work is to bring those types of folks together. And I realized pretty early that often people kind of see a need to come together, right? They see a need kind of to share work. So I'm just going to... But they come from kind of multiple different perspectives, right, into that work. They come in with lots of different beliefs and lots of different ways of thinking about the issue. And I found that often there's a push, right? Well, let me just say out loud. And sometimes those perspectives are fine, right? So sometimes the different perspectives are, we need to really work on the symptoms, right? For example, I work on a lot of hunger. So we need to feed people, right? We have hungry people and hungry children right now. We need to feed them. And then there are other group of people that say, well, sure, we need to feed them, but we actually need to work on what's causing them to be hungry, right? And so you have folks who are like, okay, yeah, we need to work on that, but I'd like to focus on kind of the symptom, or I'd like to focus on the root cause. That's often a tension people come into the work with, right? And that's fine, because most of the time we can say, yep, we need to work on symptoms and root cause, right? Like we have this kind of agreement that we can do that. Another place that people tend to kind of come into two different ways of looking at things is we need to work from one vision, we're all human beings, right? We need to work from this idea of commonality, right? What we have in common will take us forward. And then we have another group of folks who are like, well, yeah, that's true. What we have in common is true, but we're also really different, and we need to honor that difference and understand that difference as we go forward, right? And most of the time people can say, yeah, that's true too. I mean, I see us all nodding our heads, right? It makes sense that when these things are perspectives, they're not problematic. Because often we can kind of open our view and think about it and say like, oh, okay, yep, I kind of get that perspective. Where it becomes problematic, where we kind of get stuck, is like, so, but what are we going to do? Right? So I understand your perspective on working on symptoms. You understand my perspective on working with root causes. But we got work to do. So how are we actually going to do it, right? And that's where having these different perspectives can be hard. That's where we get stuck, because some people want to start at symptoms, some people want to start at root causes, right? And so it's not the perspectives themselves that actually are problematic. It's where my projects and my work, so I'm just going to speak from my point of view, has gotten stuck is kind of like this where to start, because people disagree about what's more important. And very specifically on issues of equity, people get stuck on wanting to agree on what the problem is and how we should solve it before we take any action. And what we know from the complexity arena, and the complexity teaches, like, we can spin on that forever. We could spin on developing a common vision forever. We could spin on coming up with a common analysis forever, right? What I'm finding in the groups that I'm working with is it's actually less important to come to an agreement on those things. Instead, we need to see the next step, right? And this goes right along with the complexity theory, and like everything is not knowable at the outset, right? What is the next step we're willing to take together? And this came up for me really strongly in some work I was doing in Detroit around transforming the food system. And we were working with folks who were farmers. We were working with folks who were food bankers. We were working with folks who were activists around food. We were working with racial justice activists. We were working with land developers. We were working with, academics, right? And the idea, the shared work actually was transforming the food system. Right? But we couldn't agree on much else, to be perfectly frank, right? So some people wanted to jumpstart the economy of Southeast Michigan, right, through a business innovation center and really kind of land development. And some people in the group didn't believe in capitalism, right? So like really different points of view. That probably, just to say, like those folks, we could have probably met 5 or 6 years and wouldn't have actually come to an agreement, right? But what we could do as a group, and I'll talk about it in a minute, is actually we could figure out the next step together. We could figure out that we were willing to share work around this issue. The need to transform the food system was such that there was shared work there. And that's often what I'm finding in these complex issues, whether it's hunger or homelessness or race or violence. The need is present, and we can share work around it without having to agree on even sometimes a common vision or a common analysis of what's happening. And what that allows, frankly, is people to join the work from their perspective and their sense of purpose, or their organization's perspective, or their organization's purpose, right? So everyone gets to keep that piece, right? I'm not asking people to give up their purpose. If I'm a food pantry, my purpose is giving out food, right? And so if we begin to go into work and I say, well, giving out food's not important, you actually need to solve the root problem, right? I don't actually let them participate. It's like, what is your purpose and how can it fit into this shared work, right? Doesn't mean you won't do other activities, right? Please go keep doing your other activities. What it does is it keeps us, I always say, it keeps us from collapsing down into a false consensus or commonality that we don't have. You're still allowed. Like, so in Detroit, for that particular work, the racial justice activists were still able to go out and do their racial justice training and that work, and they could come into this work with a specific lens, with strategies, with shared work we'd agreed upon, which didn't mean they weren't doing completely different things outside of that work together. So I think that it becomes important because often we strive to some commonality that I think actually doesn't allow the complexity to be addressed, right? And we oversimplify into one way of looking at things, one way of addressing things, our way of addressing things, right? Which sometimes, if we have enough power, works, right? I mean, like we can kind of strong arm people into doing it our way. That works if we have enough power to do that. But what it doesn't do is actually allow the richness of different perspectives. Sometimes perspectives I don't love, right, or aren't my perspectives, to add in. But it's important that that person and that organization that's involved in the shared work still gets to keep their purpose, right? It's not about convincing people or washing that away. It's about saying, what's our next step? What are we willing to do together next? That was a question given to me by Myron Lowe in Minnesota. What are we willing to do together next? And that's our shared work, right? If we can identify what's the next step, what are we willing to do together next, that's our shared work. It doesn't mean that we have a whole 5-year plan for these are all the things we're willing to do together. In Detroit, they decided on 6 strategies that actually everyone felt good about, and they were really different strategies, right? One was around a training program for black farmers. One was around a youth development program through karate, right? It was fantastic. Another was around this business innovation center, right? And so they said, okay, these are the 6 things we're willing to work together on next, right? Doesn't mean forever, doesn't mean when I leave this room that I'm not working on other things, right? So it was a place for us to come together, shared work. So that's kind of, for me, a really important concept when we think about what we're working in complexity. What is the shared work we can see with each other? It's not all of our work, but what can we share? And to do that, I found that the groups I'm in It's really helpful for me as a person who's hosting those groups, and for the groups themselves, when I've seen them be successful, there are some stances that they bring to the work or that we begin to cultivate together. And stances are just perspectives about the work, right? That are not necessarily about the content of the work, but how we're going to work together, or our lens on the work. And the first stance is relationship as resolution. This is actually in your journal. I'm not sure what page, but it is definitely 70. It's around 70. It's page 70-ish. No.
I'm sorry, 57.
57.
Neither was a 70.
No. Right. 107. Oh, wait. Oh, okay.
57.
So page 57. So this is in there. But the first stance that I think has been really helpful, because when you bring this kind of diverse perspectives together, and as I understand what you all are facing with changes, you may be gathering some really different perspectives, right? Perspectives that probably are so different you may not be able to come together on agreement on what, on an understanding. But also the roles are so different. Your goals are different, right? And that's kind of okay. That's, for me, is why you can keep your organizational purpose. And often we'll say to people, I get that your organization is about this, right? And so, that's just in the room with us as we share this work. We don't have to get rid of that. So one of the first stance that we talk about, or that I found has been really useful, is beginning to think about relationship as a resolution, right? So often we see a problem in front of us, and we think we have to solve that problem. And that's great if we know the answer to that problem. But again, complex systems, there's not a direct, necessarily, solution to find. And so if there aren't easy solutions, right? So again, I'm working in hunger, homelessness, violence. Friends, that is not something we're going to solve in a 3-year project, for example. With the folks that you are working for, some of their issues are going to be ongoing. And so to somehow think that there's going to be a finish line where we've got it solved, where we've created the perfect system that responds, isn't realistic, right? We work towards that always, right? It's not to get us off of that, but that actually, when we are in long-term work together across difference over time, relationship is one of our key ways of resolution. Staying in relationship with each other, continuing to try again, to work it out, to figure out the way forward, is a key space of resolution. So, for example, in this Detroit work, we were doing an exercise, right, and we were looking at all the different causes, and we were looking at root causes, and one of the young black farmers said, I think we have to put race as like one of the root causes around this food system imbalance and how we're not, right? So this is Flint, Detroit, right? That's not actually a very controversial thing to suggest. And one of the older white farmers said, when she says, I think we need to consider it, I think we need to think about the words of our Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. And he just says something that completely just dismisses what she said. Right? And so as a host at that point, I just said, we've agreed that it doesn't have to be important to all of us to be important. And so if it's important to her, we're going to put it up. We're going to, I'm not asking you to agree that it's not important to you, but it is important to her. So at the break, it was really interesting. At the break, he walked over to her, and he said, I think I have something to learn from you. And he sat down beside her, and they just had a conversation. And so what he did was, he didn't say, I agree with you, or you're going to change my mind. I think I have something to learn from you. And she was willing to stay in relationship with him, right? She didn't say, forget you, dude, I'm out of here. they we weren't going to resolve race in the food system that day, right? Which is what people all often want to do. How do we make a rule? How do we make a process that will mean we never disagree about that again? We've got it solved, right? Instead, he moved closer into a relationship with her, and she was willing. She didn't have to. There were other people in that room, I think, who would have been supportive of him and helped him had she not been able at that moment. It wasn't necessarily her responsibility. But the relationship, they stayed in a relationship. And that's actually in the Detroit work what we figured out. Like, we had long-term work to do together. And as long as we could stay together, that in itself was huge. If we could stay together across work over time. So this relationship is resolution. How do we stay in relationship as we do the work together? We may not leave the room agreeing. We may not leave but when we're in long-term issues, we have to have long-term solutions, and that requires us to be together, right? My friends, Aaron and Yayo, always say there's no away. Like, you can't throw people away because there's no way to. Where's away, right? Like, we're still in New Jersey, right? We're still going to see each other. We're still going to be together. And so, if I actually think that there's no away with you, how do I stay in relationship with you? Now, friends, please do not hear that as you need to stay in any kind of abusive relationship, right? That's not what I'm saying here. There are times to walk away, and that relationship isn't, it's too much. But I think that we tend to just say, can't work with them. She said that this one time. Like, they clearly don't get it. They're racist. Like all these ways that we kind of throw people away, right? As if we don't have to do work with them. Right? Just because you decide to throw them away doesn't mean they're not still in their position, still doing work. It's not easy. I probably should have said that. So these stances aren't, I would say this isn't for the faint of heart. If you actually take your work seriously and you take the understanding of complexity seriously, like, this is hard work. It's not the easy. This is the five steps to getting rid of difference in how you move forward together, right? Like, it's just an ongoing thing. For me, that's been one of the gifts of the art of hosting practice, is in my best days, don't throw people away, right? Not that I'm perfect at it or, don't struggle with it. It's a hard one. And the closer you are in relationship, sometimes the easier it is to see relationship as the resolution. Right? Because you're invested in each other. So that's a benefit of being in relationship, right? So that I don't want to throw you away, even if you hurt me. Right? Relationship is resolution. Second one is inquiry as an answer. Again, we are facing major issues, and for some of us, they're life and death issues. Like, I don't want to minimize that, right? Sometimes when we're making decisions around homelessness in my community, the homelessness funder will break down in tears and say, I understand that this decision might mean that someone has to do something terrible to get a place to sleep tonight. Like, and I have to live with that decision that we're making today, right? It's not that I'm saying that these are easy answers that we're looking for. But sometimes there isn't an answer today. Sometimes we have to live into an answer. And so to do that, sometimes the answer isn't, yes, we need steps forward. Yes, we need actually to decide and probe and prototype and just like get it out there and try something. And sometimes our answer are more questions, right? So whenever I start a process with people, we talk about what are the questions we think we should be in. And then often we kind of line those up, right? And that's our path forward. Okay, so we've got a year. These are the questions we think we should be in this year. First 3 months are going to be about these set of questions. Next 3 months are going to be about these set of questions. Next 3 months. So inquiry, how can you get curious with each other? How can you ask good questions, right? What is it, the Einstein quote? If I had an hour to solve the world's toughest problem, I'd spend 55 minutes coming up with a question, because then if I came up with the right question, to get the answer in 5 minutes. So there's something about actually being curious together and being in question together and identifying what are the good questions. So in all of our community engagement events around hunger, we, in an ongoing way, ask about what are the questions we haven't asked ourselves yet? What are the questions we dare not ask ourselves yet? What are the questions we're afraid to ask ourselves now? What are the questions that are coming up for us now? We're always asking for what are the questions we need to be in. And in our homelessness work, and I just found this out about a couple months ago, it just shocked me. In our homelessness work, we commissioned so we needed to redesign our system, our adult homelessness system in our city, which again was the best practice in the country. So, and we knew it was unsustainable and not getting the results it needed, and so we needed to redesign it. And so we commissioned a research report, right? And, you know, they gave us great information about what's happening around the country and all those things, and they also gave us questions to be in. Because their thing was, actually, you know, we can give you this, we don't know what's going to work in your community. And their second report was this set of questions we needed to be in on how we were going to design the homelessness system. So this idea of inquiry as an answer, that sometimes you're not going to solve it, but you are going to find out what's the next question to help you take the next step. What's the next question to help you take the next step? What do we need to be curious about now? And I just hold that personally, often when I'm really struggling to stay with someone, like, is there a place I can get curious here? Again, I don't want to present this as if like I'm perfect and loving and my projects go smoothly and beautiful and people love each other all the time. Sometimes it's really, really hard. And I just actually want to throw somebody away. And I want to like call their supervisor and say, don't let them come back to our meeting. They're too disruptive, right? Like that's also true. But again, with now having done work over time on issues where there isn't a finish line, where we actually have to stay together and keep making change, the groups that are successful, this is where we're landing as a group. And that doesn't mean, often it's me holding it as a host for a bit, but then they begin to hold it, right? So I didn't do anything in Detroit with that farmer. He went over to her. She decided she could respond to him. They stayed in relationship. Inquiry answers the second one. The third stance or perspective is all levels, all the time. And so we are working on multiple different levels all the time. We're working on the personal level, we're working on the interpersonal level, we're working on our organizational level, we're working in our systems level, we're working with structural issues, right, around access and oppression and difference. And so this perspective just invites us to be aware that all of our actions and the next steps we'll take have impact on all levels all the time. And we can think that through together. So what feels personal between Mandy and I actually absolutely impacts the organization. Could have impact on the system sometimes. I mean, you all have seen that when you're in systems work, that two people who kind of get into it and can't figure something out absolutely impact the rest of the organization, which can impact an entire system. Right? And so there's something about paying attention to all levels and understanding what we're doing matters on all levels. Now, strategically, we may decide to intervene at an organizational level. We may decide to intervene on an interpersonal level or on a personal level. But that has ramifications, right? And so, and you all know this. You know that what happens with the folks that you are working for impacts you. It impacts when you go home to your families, if they don't happen to be in your immediate families. It impacts how you show up at work. How you show up at work impacts the organization, right? Like there are all sorts of ripple effects, and it's just worth being aware of. Some folks will say, and I think that's a key place that difference comes up, because some folks want to only intervene on an organizational level, or only want to intervene on a structural level, or only, like they're saying, and actually I just read a newspaper op-ed this morning somebody sent to me that was all about, like, we just need to be one. And once we personally know that we're one with other people, that will just shine a light for the rest of the world, and that's amazing. And you know, like, I think that's a cool thing. Like, I think, yeah, that would be great if we could all do that. But I think what is challenging for me is when we think that there's one way. Even if that one way feels great and oneness, right? So this all levels all the time for me encourages us to be thinking about more than one way. Yes, let's take a next step on the interpersonal level. Yes, let's take a next step on the structural level. Yes, let's take a next step on the organizational level, right? Like, so we don't get fooled that intervening one place is all there is to do. It certainly has impacts across the system, but we need to pay attention to all levels all the time. So I'm in groups that often just have a tendency, or the tension in the group is some people want to go really micro here or here, and some people want to be really big, structural, here or here. And the issue is, like, the structural people think you who want to be here are just narcissistic and, you know, like, and like, what's the criticism you always hear? Like, you just want to take it to your mat, right? Like, it's all going to your yoga mat and you're just going to figure it out, right? I'm thinking about race here, right? But then, right, I mean, like, you know, like, that's the criticism. But the other criticism is all I'm doing is thinking about structural. I'm actually not thinking about how I'm showing up and how I'm impacting people. And that does matter, right? It does. Both of those pieces matter. And along the continuum matter. So it's all levels all the time. It's great in your group if you can have people who have attention to these different levels, right? And work with people who have attention to those different levels. And our little, I work with a really small company. There's just 3 of us and we're friends. And this is a generalization. But my friend Phil, my colleague Phil, like, really is into personal work and personal transformation. He's very much into that. And my partner Deb tends to think more interpersonally and sometimes organizationally, and I go right to systems and structure, right? Like, that, you know, like, that's great, but what does that mean for the bigger, you know what I mean? Like, I tend to go right there. But it's actually a great working relationship that we don't focus on the same thing, because we'll miss things. And so working together with people who have a different lens than you is actually pretty important in that way. As long as you can not make it personal. Oh, you don't care about systems and structure, right? Because you care about the personal, right? Or you don't care about this, right? So often, like, these are just perspectives and we make them into personalities and things to like or dislike, when they're actually just a way of, like, looking at the world that's really helpful if we can have it all together. Fourth perspective or stance is to seek multiplicity. How do we seek ways to allow people to bring their whole selves into our shared work, right? So that we are not, and I've just heard this so often over these last 2 days, that we're not essentializing people into one particular piece about them, right? And that can be essentializing them around their perceived abilities. It could be essentializing them about their role in an organization. It can be essentializing them around their race. It could be essentializing them around their perspective. Oh, you're that person, right? Like, you're always going to be the person who brings up that, right? But how do we invite and seek people to bring their whole selves into the work? And that, for me, when people can see themselves as more than that one essential thing, they're willing to stay in relationship. They're willing to be curious together. They're willing to think about different levels. How do we invite multiplicity into our work? How do we invite the whole person in? A simple way we do this is check-ins, right? Check-ins begin to disrupt that. Just having everyone say hello and say something different about themselves, right? So one of the check-ins I think we're going to do, Kim, I think you had suggested doing something like, everybody say one thing you wouldn't know about them, right? That's a great check-in. It's a great check-in because you learn people in a different way than you've ever learned them, right? And it's like, oh, wow, you're a hula hoop person too? Like, it's just really different, right? Who's a hula hoop person? Hands up, hula hoops. Hula hoops. That's right. That's right. So just something you wouldn't know. Then you can just... And it just begins to invite different perspectives of a person into a room. It's simple, check-in, super. That's the easiest way to begin to seek multiplicity. You know, if you ask people, what do you need to bring into the room with you and what do you need to leave as we come into this meeting? That simple question will give you a wealth of information. People might say, well, I need to leave. I left a sick kid this morning and I'm actually really worried about them. You know, and then when they show up in the meeting instrument, you might go, oh, their kid is sick. That makes sense. Or you can say, oh, I have a sick kid too. Or what do I need to bring in? Well, I need to bring in more optimism because we just had a really hard meeting down at the county right now, right? You know what I mean? Like, there's just, like, you just get to see them bigger. And so seeking multiplicity, so check-in is a great way to do it. I talked about sensing interviews. The other day, that's a great way we bring in multiplicity, so you begin to see the whole person and not just that one piece about them. And I think it's not enough to, for me, this is the one that we have to kind of keep at. How do we continue to see the whole person? What are the questions we can ask? How can we invite them to show up? You know, these processes, checking in, circle, cafe, open space, absolutely invite multiplicity, right? When you let people set their agenda, I was at an open space once in the middle of 3 days, and one of the people who runs a free clinic in our community said, I'm going to post a dance party. And she's like, because we've been in really heady conversation right now, and I just need to dance it out. And it was so amazing. Like, she's got some stature in our community, right? And for her to say, I'm going to do a dance party. And so, like, 5 or 6 of them just had a dance party. And it was pretty delightful and pretty unexpected. And every time I see her, I think about how she threw a dance party. Right? You know what I mean? It just begins to invite some difference in. Fifth stance is power matters. So often, especially when we think about bringing people together, we want our processes or we want our relationships to somehow negate the power differentials in the room. And we'd like that to be the case, and so we act as if that's the case. And I just think that's not the case. I think that power does matter. And how we work with it and think about it and are intentional about it can be the difference between our project succeeding and not succeeding. And so, yes, Circle is a place for every voice. That is true. But it doesn't mean the dynamics of difference and oppression aren't still acting in our circle. That's also true. What excites me about Circle is it's like the place to practice being different together, right? It's like the possibility. It brings the possibility of equity, but just sitting in that forum doesn't mean we're equal. Right? And so attending to the power differences is important. And as a person who's leading the meeting, like that, so that's my role. I guess I should have said that. So my role, right, is as a consultant. People invite me in, I help them work through processes, but I'm not based in an organization, and so I should have said that at the beginning. Please translate to your particular position in the organization, because I have some freedom sometimes as a consultant coming in to do things that folks in an organization don't have, but I also don't always have the power to do some things in an organization that people do have, so just kind of like translate for your own context. But the big thing is that power matters. It just makes a difference. And so if we are trying to pretend that it doesn't, we can get tripped up pretty easily. And so I want to talk a little bit about power quickly, and I want to get you all into conversation. So I was trained, I think I've mentioned, with the math thing, I mentioned I was a social worker. I was trained in a very specific way of thinking about power, and so I just want to share that, because I think we say power, and power is not power is not power is not power. There are different kinds of power. Primarily right now I'm going to be talking about the power between people, so I'm talking about relational power, not personal empowerment. But it's worth kind of knowing. So I learned about 3 different kinds of power. And the first is power over, right? That's I have more power, you have less power. For whatever reason, right? Could be about position, you're my boss. Could be about, you're my funder. Could be about identity and who has power in this country. Could be my group has less power, right? So it's kind of like the typical hierarchical power over. And so for me, when we're thinking about working in complexity, we have to loosen up our ideas a little bit about power in this way, because often we're used to things like speaking truth to power, or convincing power that our way is right, or leveraging power, or negotiating power. And it's not that those things aren't important. And I'm finding in my work, as I work with more and more senior leaders, that the question is, how do we engage power and those in power, as well as we engage those without perceived power, right? So often we have really equipped practices and really developed practices to engage those who are marginalized, who have less voice, but we would never think about engaging those with power in that way. It's like, oh no, you guys have power. We don't have to, we don't have to think about your concerns. They're not important because you have power. right? Like we just kind of dismiss. And so I'm interested in a different conversation with those who are in power. And what that could look like, and how we actually engage. We talk about engagement, how we actually engage across the ecosystem and across power, right? So what is it that I need to like give up in my own ideas? If we had another day, we'd probably do a process where we give up some of our limiting beliefs or work on our limiting beliefs about power. But I'm in power over when working with people who have more perceived power than you, often, and it's not that that's not real, right? Like I walk into rooms all the time where I'm aware that I am a youngish looking black woman in a room that does not look at all like me. I'm aware of that power differential, and that's true. And sometimes people are waiting to meet me, and I'm not waiting to meet them because of my ideas about their power. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist or anything like that, but I'm saying like my own, like you have power, and so I see you, all I see is your power and not a relationship sometimes gets in the way. So how do we actually engage power with just as much integrity as we engage those without power, with just as much care and concern and interest and curiosity and relationship, right? Like how do we do that? Like that to me is kind of exciting, but it's no, it's all right. It's good. Okay, power over. That's power over. I want to keep, power with. I want to make sure you all have time to chat with each other. Power with. This was the third kind of power I learned about. This is the kind of collaborative model. I have some power, I'll share it with you. You have some power, you'll share it with me. We'll share resources. Often, this is collaboration, right? I mean, like that's the idea. This is what good collaboration would look like. The challenge, I think, is often collaboration is forced not because of desire to share power, but we're forced to collaborate. You have to write an MOU. You have to have 3, particular people on your MOU that have signed a letter of intent, and so it becomes like this forced kind of sharing power with. And so I think, the question for me is, who do we want to be in relationship with? What are the different ways of sharing power there? That is not just about resources. So I see a lot of groups that are large organizations kind of collaborating with smaller organizations because they have to, because of grants or whatever. But those smaller organizations actually don't have a whole lot of power. Right? They actually aren't. So how do we actually begin to share power in that way? Power with people. And then the third kind of power that I learned about was power for. And that's... I have some power for a specific reason, and I'm going to use it for you on your, I have more power than you, I'm going to use it on your behalf. This is like the ally or advocacy model, right? I've got more power, I have more access, I'm going to use it on your behalf. And so I think that we just have to be careful that that's not a slippery slope to my own gratification, that I'm important. So I was working with a group in town, and it was all people of color, and we were trying to have a dialogue after a particular incident in our community. And I said, there were 4 of us around the room, and I said, well, I think our next step is to make our group bigger. Right? Like, I think we just need to make our group bigger and hear what other people are thinking about. So, who do you know? Like, we're just... And one of the people got really upset. And she said, Tuesday, I feel like you're telling me I don't know what my people need. And I was like, I am telling you that. I am telling you that. I think you can know what you need. I think you have some ideas about your community. I think that... that we have to be bigger. We have to be bigger. We have to invite in more voices. And this power for, and let me just say I was an ally and an activist and worked on behalf of battered women for a long time. And it's just a really slippery slope before help becomes control, before care becomes control. I think I know best. So I'm going to, Doug, you gave us a great example of caring that became controlling with one of the folks that you work for. And so often we can see it in other people, but we don't see it in ourselves. We think we're being protective. We think we're being helpful, right? And so what does that look like to actually say, okay, what's a use of power for that has integrity? What is it that you need me to do? And what is it that you can do on your own, right? I always, the old social work adage is, if I'm working harder than my client, I'm doing too much. right? And so just be thinking about that, because care and control can they're really close. They're really close. And so that's just like, those are the conversations in thinking about power. And then finally, because I think that there are ways to have integrity in all of this, I think we need to consider all of this as we're working together across difference. And it occurs to me that all of this is very transactional, right? There's a certain amount of power, you either have it or you don't, you share it or you don't, you use it or you don't. But like power is like this finite resource. And so one of the things that I've been working with and thinking about with my groups is what would power, if it weren't a finite resource, what would something like, I've just been calling it power among look like? Where actually, if that we don't believe that power has an end, right? And I'm not saying this from a naive place, but if we actually began to act as if I have enough power, you have enough power, when you take up your power, I have more power, right? And we worked from that place instead of kind of hoarding power, right? Because in this model, somebody has it, they give it away, there's just a certain amount. In this model, it's like a well. I'm going to go to the well, you're going to go to the well, we're both going to get water. And so I think I've started to see that in my own experience around groups that actually, when something good happens for this organization or that organization, it's intangible, but this other organization rises too, right? And what's that about? That's primarily, almost always it's based in relationship. We see it with, I always give an example of artists or singers, Prince passed away recently, and I was just aware of how much his taking up his power in my childhood empowered me. Without no relationship with the man at all, right? Although I'm sure if he knew me, he would have loved me. Oh my gosh, we were so best friends my whole life. That's exactly right. Chris talks about the work of truth and reconciliation having the possibility of power among, but what if we actually began to not work with power as a scarcity mindset, that there is enough, and we can have that. Either way, working with power matters, thinking about it as you set things up. The groups I'm working with, if they can stay in relationship, if they can stay curious, if they attend to multiple levels, if they're letting their whole selves show up to the work we're doing, and if they're not ignoring power, we're getting some real traction. We're actually beginning to shift things. So that's, as we share work, we're beginning to shift things. I know you probably have a lot of questions.
Please repeat the last part. You said allow your whole self to show up.
And don't ignore power. Yeah. Like, we're actually getting some real traction and making some change. Doesn't mean we have a finish line. Doesn't mean we won't have to figure it out later and differently next year, but we're getting some real traction.